Let me start off our session to remind that we acknowledge the respect of the Quorum Subsistence Quorum peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Quorum the San peoples on whose historical relationship to this land continues to this day. Some of this land acknowledgement will probably be part of what we hear today when we talk about ecological governance. I'm not sure, you have both, you have water and wildfire, so we'll find out where's your real passion. Give me the great pleasure to use Bridget McGlynn today as our presenter, and probably you can encounter Bridget in the hallways. She comes to us as a PhD candidate at Queensland University of Technology, running the POLIS project through particular grant and industry engagement internship. And her passion and her work is trying to think about, through a network analysis, about environmental governance, collaborative form of governance, as opposed to some community-based forms of governance, also here on the west coast of Canada. And Bridget comes also, through a little diversion through Australia, from Brock University, where she was a research assistant in the Environmental Sustainability Research Center, and where she also gained her MA at the time. And you can see here where her research has taken her. So it's a real pleasure having you in our hallways. How much longer are you here for, Bridget?
Next Friday.
Oh, okay. So we don't exactly know what it is to hear about your research and then back to Queensland.
Yes.
Okay. So all the more, it's a great pleasure having you, and of course we can see you.
Thank you. Okay, that sounds good. So thank you everyone for joining me today. Before I get into my slides, it's been a pleasure to get to join you at the past 2 months. In my experience, has been a very unique academic environment. It's been very welcoming. I love the global talks and everyone's different expertise over the weeks. So it's been wonderful to join. And for a rather inconspicuous boardroom, this feels like quite this prestigious stage. It's just interesting. So in my other hat, I am a PhD student at the Queensland University of Technology, which is in Brisbane, Australia. And so we, in my other hat, acknowledge our traditional owners, which are the Turrbal and Yurra people, and recognize that has always been a place of teaching and research. So today I'm mostly going to talk about my research, which is focused on the idea of social-ecological. And that is very much based in the social-ecological systems literature. So I'll go through some of the assumptions that we bring from that literature into my research. I'll talk a bit about how I use network analysis and how we frame networks in that context, and then go into the results of the first case of my thesis, which is about flooding in the Wolastoq, or the St. John River, which is in Eastern Canada, and then some reflections about working with POLIS, which has been about. So for starters, there we go. Maybe it's strong thought. So my research is very much positioned in a social ecological systems framing, where we think of people as part of the environment and not separate from it or managing it. Sort of like 1960s, 70s environmental management is very much people separate from these because they draw. That usually has a lot of unintended outcomes for ecological processes, for things we see in human communities. So we use this framing that we are and have always been actively shaping and shaped by the environment, and think of it as a system. We specifically think of it as a complex adaptive system. So as a complex adaptive system. So what we mean by that, like a system, we have a components that interact, a complex system, those interactions are nonlinear. And in a complex adaptive system, some of the components have the capacity to change their behavior in a way that can alter sort of systems directly. And so an important assumption in this is that the whole thing becomes a much more than the sum of its parts. So there's emergent behaviors. It's open to things that are happening in BC are influenced by processes across other spatial scales, different timelines. And so it's better to think of the whole thing sort of as a process than rather any sort of step point. And so in this framing, we can think of sustainability as a process. So if we take that United Nations definition that preserving we have for future generations, that isn't an endpoint, but it's rather collective capacity to handle change and navigate it to create those outcomes of being sustained required resources or processes for future generations. So dealing with that sort of system of mindset, that complexity, there's corresponding recommendations for how to make decisions in those systems. There's lots of, specific niches into what we call it, but some of the general recommendations are there should be different types of actors, different types of information. They should interact in a way that promotes learning and adaptation. The decisions should happen at multiple levels. Generally, there should be some form of collaboration. And additional recommendation that's a little bit more hidden, more niche, is that the governance system should fit with the problem it's trying to address. So that's sort of the focus of the PhD research is social-ecological fit. So the definition we use is how governance structure and function aligns with the problem it's trying to address. That's pretty meaningless. So by governance, we mean the system for addressing social concerns and opportunities. We really need much more than just crown government. So it's that whole formal decision-making process, but also the informal side and how it interacts with, social institutions and non-governmental organizations. And by structure, those are the specific agencies, organizations, and their relationships, and functions are the processes of the system. So for defining the governance system, we also need to define the problem, and we generally think about problems along 3 scales in terms of space, like physical space, timelines, and then also function, which would be processes, so ecological, social ecological processes in the system. I find it best to talk through an example, and if you watch the blue dialogue, you'll see the same example, but these slides to go out, so I like these. So let's say we have a river, and the river floods, which is pretty standard in this case. If we think along spatial thing, if we have a bunch of different jurisdictions along the river, we're gonna need some level of coordination, if not collaboration, among the different jurisdictions or organizations working, because what happens upriver is going to have impacts on flooding extents downriver. If this is a stronger border, let's say it crosses like a country or provinces, there's probably an additional level of government that we also need to incorporate, because they're also going to have some sort of jurisdiction making different management actions. So spatially, we want all these different players working in some sort of coordinated fashion. That'll look like different things in different contexts, but somehow they need to be involved. It's generally the idea. We can also think it along times. So flooding in the Wolastoq is sort of an annual occurrence, usually a spring flood. So we might need that sort of short-term annual planning. And what is our communication? What is emergency response? How do you do immediate, or public. But also you can't be only planning for 1 year at a time. You might want a 5-year time frame. Okay, what are some of the infrastructure projects that we need to start to implement to try to change some of the impacts of these floodings, gray or natural? We also might want to think about, okay, in 2050 or 2100, what is flooding going to look like in this area? What are some of those long-term actions we should start working towards now to try to make that not absolute case? So we don't have long-term time, so it'll fit into the multiple time horizons. We can also think of fit in terms of function. So in function is those ecological or social-ecological processes that are happening. This is important when we think of governance also often happens in environments. So we've been exploring this a bit in the POLIS project. We have watershed governance, and then there's a different group of people who focus on wildfire. But wildfire is going to have implications on watershed governance. They generally happen differently in separate. So because everything's connected, we need some sort of connections. In the context of flooding, in this example, let's say we have forestry upstream, how that land is managed is going to have impacts on how water enters the river, how it floods. If we have industry or power generation, what water is being taken out, what gets dammed, that's going to have impacts on flooding. And then we also probably have people who want to use the river for cultural, spiritual, recreation, food. That is also an important process of the system that needs to be taken into account. So those are sort of our 3 main scales that we think are really important. So on to some numbers. So given that we think of these systems, like it's a social ecological system, we define systems as interactions between components. networks give us one useful tool to sort of model those systems because we have components interacting. Networks can be also used in sort of more, let's say, natural science, and sometimes they're called, graphs and vertices. I use the language of nodes, so those are entities and ties. So some networks we interact with every day, like internet, a website, connected by hyperlinks, social media, profiles connected, following links. So you can really just take the idea of nodes connected by relationships and apply them to a lot of things in the world. When thinking about governance, we usually look at how organizations or maybe individuals are interacting in different ways. So maybe they're working on a project together, they're co-writing a paper, we can find a lot of difference. So there's a lot of utility in it. And so when we think of fit and we have a system, this example I pulled from Oregon Modine's Something Science paper, which if you are intrigued by my talk, I would recommend reading. It's fabulous. And so we have a group of fishers who are harvesting different fish. So their ability to process savings over time is going to partially depend on their ability to communicate or coordinate, because they're all harvesting different fish that are interacting based on their own trophic interactions. So if their fit in the system would be these boats working together, whatever that means, to know what other people are playing out and how that's going to impact their own meals and maybe their own decisions. So we can sort of model the system, different parts of the system as nodes, and that's relationships. And so we take sort of the flooding example I presented earlier, where we have the different jurisdictions. If say those are communication relationships, we could turn that into like a little baby network. And when we have something small, it'd be easy to sort of qualitatively make comments about it, like, oh, this person has a lot of ties, maybe they're very influential. We can do it using metrics, or you can kind of do it intuitively, like, we are social beings, we could probably say something about that. But when we think of actual governance networks at a watershed scale, even really in bigger scale, like a little example, they get really messy really quick. And so then we need to start using metrics. One, to describe the network, like you might have descriptive statistics, even more sort of modeling processes to start to learn sort of what's happening in these networks. Especially when we create multiple levels of networks. So in the fisher example, you have boats connected to the species. In this example, for my research, we have a collaboration network, which is organizations connected via collaboration. And then on this side, they're connected to all the different floodplain tasks. It's kind of a nebulous idea, but you can't look at that and see. So we need to start using some math. I'll give it a minute. Cool. So the Wolastoq River is in eastern Canada. That's right there. Canadian official name. Oh, we went too far. That's okay. Oh no, we went real far. Sorry. There we go. Okay. It's still technically known as the St. John River, but they're trying to reestablish the traditional name. And so it tends to flood seasonally. Usually in the spring, there might be one earlier in the season, it's more of an ice-stream flood. And then you'll get the spring freshet, which tends to be larger, any time between sort of like now and the beginning of June.
So
And
where is it?
Eastern Canada. So it's headwaters, New Brunswick.
But where's the river at? I can't see it.
That's the watershed.
Oh, the watershed, so.
Yeah, so
okay.
that's the
You don't
entire
see the river.
watershed. Watershed floods in the ocean. There were two bad floods in 2018 and 2019 that sort of kind of spurred this work. Some of the very active organizations in the basin started discussing like how they're going to tackle flooding more meaningfully, given sort of climate change, what they expect might change flooding patterns to be. And so my supervisors at the time at Brock University, so Brian Plummer and Julie Baird were working with a partner out based out of New Brunswick. And so that's sort of like what prompted this work to occur. And so what we did in 2020 and 2021, we sent electronic surveys to 150 organizations we had identified of potentially doing flood planning in the basin. So this was a lot of municipalities, different provincial agencies, and federal involvement, indigenous self-government, indigenous or non-profit organizations, as well as some industry consultants, whoever would involve it, and ask them, who do you work with? Where do you work? What do you work on? Where are the many questions? So that is the data I have been very fortunate to get to play with since then. And so the question I'm asking for my PhD case study is this sort of projected on the screen. So examine the tension between sort of the ecological side and the institutional side, and into what that means. So we were able to collect a multi-level network. So we were asked the organizations who they work with, and was able to construct a social network. So that's collaboration among organizations. We also asked where they work. So based on the map, those are all the different sub-basins of the watershed, where you can delineate it based on a hydrologist's definitions. So based on that, we're able to sort of create ecological nodes where you work in the river. And then we also did some interviews to understand what are essential tasks for organizations to be working on when addressing flooding at this or bigger watershed scale. And then asked them which ones they work on, and then it created sort of interconnection network based on the interviews. And so when we have multi-level networks, we can't just like look at them and say something. So what we tend to do is actually just use some mathematical modeling procedures to try to find patterns in the network. And we can use the patterns to infer what social processes are occurring or not occurring. So an example for the social ecological network, we draw on a lot of common pool resource theory. So if two organizations are working in the same place, it's generally beneficial if they work together. It's going to be instances it's not generally something we want to see. It's what we call an indication of fit. Same thing for interconnected resources. So two organizations working in interconnected areas, those connected species, generally beneficial for them to work together. This idea really much started with applying it to an ecological context, but then it was expanded to also include more of like the institutional operational side of things. So sometimes it's been applied to policy concepts, it's like, or topics and adaptation. So some work this has been done before. I lovely have a wonderful supervisory team that helped me out with this. They applied it to sort of more concrete tasks. So we can also look for a common pattern with tasks. So you will have one organization might be easier for them if their two of their tasks are interconnected, or again, if you have organizations working on interconnected tasks that they collaborate. Again, vulnerability assessment, you want that to occur before you do an adaptation plan. So perhaps those would be those sorts of patterns. And so when we look at these ecological side of the operational side, we tend to look at them separately. And I think that's largely just implied amount of choice. This is a lot of data to have in a single case. Or asking these research questions, especially when this has still just been in development, we really ask them in different papers and different case studies. I have the privilege, not my own foresight, but I'm getting the benefit of it, to combine and ask sort of like in the case. Do these things impact each other? And then also to start to tie some of these motifs or indications of it to any indication of performance. We think these things could be a good prerequisite. We think they're beneficial. We have very few empirical demonstrations of relationship. We just haven't measured it. So that's part of the attempt here. So just before I do that, I've done that modeling, I have a couple summary to go through. So first, looking at the social ecological network. This was my master's paper. We found that there's a positive tendency for organizations in the same place to work together. So that's good. That's like an indication of it. We also found that there wasn't a tendency for organizations in separate locations to work together, which is not great. Because what happens upstream in the basin is going to have direct impacts on what happens downstream. And up basin, sort of in the Wolastoq, there's a lot of forestry, it's a lot less populated. So they actually have a lot of impact in terms of like how the water is ending up downstream, there's just not as much going on. So we sort of put in this as recommendations, we need more connection throughout the whole basin. We also modeled sort of the organization task network. There wasn't a for that neutral essentially, not significant one way or the other. But there is a positive tendency for that closed square configuration. So we interpret there was a handful of organizations who do a lot of work, a lot of data collection in particular. And they sometimes they're a provincial agency. And if a lot of municipalities say rely on said data, they have to work with the provincial agency and with the closed square configuration. So not necessarily good or bad, it's just more of an observation to see that that's an occurring pattern. So for these two things, we're essentially modeling ties. So if organizations have a tie or do they not? What you could also do is model an attribute. So in this last one, what we were asking is being in this sort of pattern, this configuration, explain why an organization might be affected or not. And so what we found was working with another organization on a shared task. Wanted with key things associated. But there's current limitation, but it's interesting to see that pattern would correlate with essentially not being effective when we see so many of them of the network. But okay, this is happening. What happened?
It's that the internet connection was unstable.
Oh, okay.
Get a bit too complex for.
Okay, we're back.
You're back. I missed it.
1 second. Okay, wait again.
Okay, so this was the multi-level network. So just to get into like what my first PhD paper will be, I've done the results, we just have to write it now. Because I wanted to bring the performance piece, the performance aspect we're going to be looking at instead of that node level is going to be at the specific time. So it's task effectiveness, so how they felt for every specific task that they worked on. And then in terms of like combining this whole thing into one model that I wanted to do. So far we can't do anything with 3 level models, to my knowledge. Maybe at some point we will, that would be fun. But so I collapsed the ecological network onto the social network. So I sort of took filters of our collaboration network, which I think is actually better described in this slide. So first we have our full collaboration network. And then I essentially took like a filter, like our layer of it, only include relationships when organizations work in the same place. And sort of layer of it, only including relationships when they worked in neighboring basins. So that's our neighbor network. And from that previous results, we know there's not a ton of relationships when they're in neighboring areas. We didn't see a lot of those. So we can even just like visually see from the networks on the side, there's more ties in the full collaboration network than in the same location. And there's the least amount of ties than this last network in the neighboring network. And so then what I did was a modeling procedure, which is a network autocorrelation model. I mean, like network stuff, we can talk about later, to try to understand if any of these different sort of patterns in the network were correlated with being more effective at tasks. And so what we found, so across the board, all highlighted, more collaborative ties. So more ties was not beneficial. The other thing that stuck out was for this ecological neighbor network. We have this really entangled configuration. So it's you're working with another organization and there's two tasks. Those tasks rely on each other and you both work on both tasks. So it could be an example of you're both working on a vulnerability assessment to then work on an adaptation plan. The vulnerability assessment will inform the adaptation plan. So the tasks relating, you're both involved. This was positive, very positive and significant, indicating this was a very helpful configuration to be in, but only in the ecological neighborhood, which was interesting. And I have some other models, so this was the most interesting bit so far. So some takeaways overall from portion of the study was having more recommendation, and of course it's in a different, in every case, but I think having more studies like this might try to push, academics collect. We need to work together. Okay, we're past that. Let's understand this better. What's also interesting is that there is no evidence, so from this middle column, that working in the same location, so there was a whole series of models, that working in the same location made you more effective at a task. So that was kind of prompted me to try to think of how outcomes are going to occur at different levels. So if we think at a watershed level, with any common pool resource ideas, it's good when two people, organizations in the same area work together. That might not actually make you more effective at your task. That a beneficial outcome might occur at a different system level, maybe not that task level. So we didn't measure it. That would be something to consider later on. And then for that sort of entangled square, the same sort of approach was used to study some wildfires. There are two cases, one here looking at the Fort McMurray fire, and then one in Sweden. And in the Swedish case, sort of the wildfire management approach, it's very horizontal. There's not a lot of like vertical structure to it. Everyone's sort of just doing their thing. They have to figure it out on the fly. They also found that this type of entangled square was beneficial for some task effectiveness. So it almost used when you need to really work with other organizations to figure out who's going to do what. Maybe you need to figure it out sort of together without a ton of imposed structure, that maybe having more influence in the whole system could be beneficial for effectiveness, but like just an interpretation. And then lastly, we tend to just ask about collaboration. It's something we can define and kind of understand. But by collaboration, there's more specific mechanisms in that. Again, problem negotiation, is it conflict resolution, is it sharing of resources? Those things can be hard to ask about, but you do need to start to dive into some of those more nuanced recommendations. And then lastly, about my time with POLIS. So it's been really fun to watch all of our friends meet.
You're not supposed to say that.
I know, I mean it in the best possible ways, because, yeah, but academics, or at least like in my experience, we're like, oh, we need to influence policy. And I think there's been a greater emphasis in training research students to be able to articulate what they think the impacts of the research are. With more emphasis, that emphasis is not always met by the required skills or, fully thought, response to that. And that's okay, it's all a learning process, but there sometimes is a default answer, and I've seen this, from undergrads to PhD students, who say, oh, I want to influence public policy. You're like, okay. Well, like it's just like, oh, it's gonna influence policy. And like that, perhaps we don't push because you're like, oh, you obviously don't know what you mean, or just because people accept that as a sufficient. And I don't think it's a sufficient answer. And it's been really interesting to see how many different avenues there are to try to shape policy. Because the standard academic one that it seems like what they can do for that is sort of that very linear approach. So you have an output, you write a paper, or you write a policy brief, maybe if you're thinking a little outside the box, you don't get excited here. And then you engage in sort of like science policy process. And or you give them the webinar even. Like here's this new finding, and you can use this now. And that's sort of the extent of the engagement. And it's always like seeing in some things I think really helpful, having that piece of evidence or push thinking overlooking. But in terms of doing anything more than just like an incremental little push, it's never super useful. So it's been really interesting to watch all the different avenues that can be pursued simultaneously to generally try to shape things in terms of like better governance, more ethical governance. And seeing all the different, I'll say, players in that realm has been interesting as someone trying to figure out what I do with my career. I also obviously study networks and enjoy networks. So watching POLIS's network in action has also been really cool. Because I like just measure them, so watching all of the effort and purposeful intention, interactions and relationships that go into building these and purposely analyzing them in a way that's like useful for a common end, even if everyone in the picture has like a slightly different need out of it, or they have a different angle of the problem or what they're getting at will be beneficial, but seeing what is their common problem, how we're going to approach this, how can we independently use our own influence. And we also think about centrality measures a lot in networks in describing them. And there's different forms of centrality. There's degree centrality, which is just having a lot of time, so if you're very popular. You have betweenness centrality, so you're sort of like a gatekeeper role, and you have access to people no one else does, and you also have like a closeness centrality, so you can just get to have them really quick. Kind of cool, there have been instances of getting to interact with people, seeing those sort of indicators play out. Impacts, right, or especially in policy or governance impacts. If it's science, maybe there isn't a more simple path of a linear implementation. Governance, not so much. I had a chat with Oliver on Fridays. Like the people who might benefit from reading governance stuff probably don't want to read governance stuff. It's probably not actually interesting to them, especially when they write it. So it's been really interesting for me to try to reflect on how I want to situate my own time and energy moving forward, given I don't know what I want to be doing. So it's just because when you see the academics, you end up like on the train, and you can stay on the train. I don't think the train's a bad place to be, but it's just nice to have more perspectives in terms of like what other implications there are or opportunities, and see how many different roles there would be. That's everything. I think those are just references. Yeah.
When the train does.
Oh no.
Thank you so much. I understand everything of my notes and all that, but I try to jump as much as possible. I have a comment and I have a question. The comment is, I wonder whether you have thought about the problem that occurs again and again in aid situations where there's a disaster or something like that. There are earthquakes in Haiti, for example, right? And we always get the reports that there's lack of coordination, and because there's so many actors, in fact, they're blocking each other in some fashion, right? And that seems to be kind of what seems to be in agreement with what you were saying about having a lot of actors in the same location doesn't necessarily increase effectiveness. I'm not sure exactly why it doesn't increase, if you didn't, I think it's specified, but that seems to be kind of support your research point. And then I thought further about, well, what if you had fewer, right? But then of course, fewer means in a case like, an earthquake or such a situation, fewer food coming in from the food, for example. So on the whole, maybe that's actually a problem then, that there's less material coming in. So maybe if you have more organizations, even if they block each other a bit, if they can bring in more resources, maybe it's still good, right? And if there's an extinction of organizations, like this happens in Russia, for example, and they're throwing them out because they're sweeping up some excuses. Those that stick behind, or in Gaza, right? Those that stick behind are still there. They can at least do something, right? Rather than, so even though they're blocked each other initially, it's just one way that they had any thoughts on all that. But the last part here intrigued me, that you talk about, what enhances effectiveness. Didn't quite understand that business about the tightly entangled square. Maybe you can say some more about that. But we were talking about POLIS and what influences policy, right? And I wasn't sure whether you had like 3 clear points about that. How exactly does academic work or research, when does it, under what circumstances or with what kind of actions does it actually generate an influence? And that can be scary too, right? That you have right-wing perspectives and they become very effective because somebody figures out how to do that. We don't want that to happen too much, right? But it would be interesting to know.
Well, I guess with the last point,
Yeah.
I guess I've got a little bit behind the current of how people who are actually working on influencing policy go about their actions. Obviously, it's been great to be at POLIS because Elmer says his client is water. I like that. Right? I would have been my client is water too. I imagine all of the same approaches could be used for any end, nefarious or collectively beneficial.
So what works is my question, I guess. To influence policy, right?
Oh, I'm sorry, that's a question for him.
Okay, yeah, so you didn't actually come to any conclusions after.
Well, I think she's concluding what doesn't work. Outputs alone don't
Yeah,
work.
outputs.
Well, that's obvious.
What you need, like,
A whole
To me, it's been
institution,
obvious for.
but yet a whole institution is built around that.
and it's rewarded.
Yeah, I know, that's, we know that's bullshit.
So I think what's been interesting is like, if I want to build a career playing the academic game, that's an option. Seems nice, sabbatical seems fun, right? That's an option. So then it'd be like, okay, so then if I would like to maybe create some more impact, even if it's still nebulous, maybe you don't, it's a little nebulous. How do I carve out time to engage with the people who would need me as a node in their influence network? Because the paper is not going to do anything. The paper gives me credibility as an expert, right? So utility there. But the people whose their full-time job is to think about policy and influence policy, and where is the government heading? Where the people in the government, what are the things they need to get reelected, like power. Almost all comes down to power and influence. So like, how can I be of use and build useful relationships and repeatedly show up for the people where my expertise could be useful? Who are those people? What resources do they need? What engagement, what dialogue? And being able to have the time to repeatedly show up for those people. But And we have a service model in academia, right? You have some time for service. Academic service is usually like, mentor students, read papers, do some, university community stuff. But maybe there's an opportunity to broaden what we classify as service. And, we have to record that and we reward it, at least put it on your CV in some way, because we still just like outputs. For those time in that engagement with like very purposeful engagement, not necessarily showing up at a community fair. That's fun. That has a place. I do governance research, something that's not. That's my thoughts. It's gonna be the engagement with the people who are, not the experts, but who have the influence and who have the power and who have sort of, the know-how of how that system works. To show up with people who get them as an expert. That's what I'd say.
Think about the next question. Let me welcome Ivan and then Jolie, the sick ones. I hope you're doing all right. And Janine, yeah, good to see you.
Janine also has a question.
Okay, Janine, all right, you have a question. That's even better. Janine, I thought you were in Vienna. It looks like you're in Federal Bay, but you're. Janine, go ahead.
In my heart, I'm still with you. Well, I just put it in the chat, so it's easier maybe to follow.
Oh, I see.
So
Okay.
thank you very much for your great presentation. And I was also just wondering if you could add a bit more context on how you get the data of what is a collaboration and how that is defined. Yeah, because of course there will be very diverse. So how did you kind of box that in? What is a collaboration and what not?
For sure. Let's see if I have the definition on one of my slides. We went back and forth for a long time about how we should define it, of course. So what we did, we sent out surveys to all the organizations we had identified, and we had a community partner in the area who had been working in the region for 20 years. So he had a list, and then I expanded that list to try to keep the net really wide, to keep if someone could be involved, we wanted to make sure they had the opportunity to participate. I want to say this was great in brain at 1.9, but we defined it as purposeful sharing information or resources or time, or implementing or planning or implementing programs or projects or something. And it was very concrete. It's you're actively sharing things or planning something together was in essence. And we defined it a couple times throughout the survey to really hammer home what we meant. We also asked them about just communication relationships first. So it's okay, who do you share information with? And then followed up with the sort of the stronger relationship question of who do you share things with? Who do you plan with?
Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Hi, thanks for a very interesting presentation. I think my question is closely related to Janine's, and I'm wondering if you can help me understand a bit more clearly some aspects of your empirical analysis. If I understood you correctly, it looks like you're trying to explain or predict organizational effectiveness as a function of these the existence or the saliency of these alternative forms of collaborative and network arrangements. But can you tell a little bit more about your dependent variable? So is effectiveness self-reported at the organizational level? Is it reported by one respondent within each organization? Have you thought at all about the challenges of a self-reported self-assessment of an outcome measure like that, and about any means you might use to sort of calibrate or rectify, through other observations? And then also, these organizations are in a bunch of different subplaces doing a bunch of different things. And so effectiveness relative to what goal? And do you have some basis to think that when, even supposing self-reported effectiveness is completely objective and impartial and has no, aspirational or self-affirming, or, other elements about it, have you thought about whether the aim toward which each respondent organization is reporting effectiveness is the same as your conception of overall effectiveness relative to your client water, or whatever is the overall?
For sure. So the measure of effectiveness was self-reporting in the survey. So it's perception depth.
Yeah.
Tons of flaws. We also do think it has some
Yeah,
value.
I'm not looking for flaws, I'm curious.
No, no, I know.
Because it's a
So,
very difficult
yeah.
task. Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
We think it has, some value in the sense that what people think of their work does impact their work. Like there's, it's not the best measure, but there's used to it. For some of the larger organizations, we emailed sort of sent the survey directly to a couple of different people. To some of the bigger bodies, we had multiple respondents that we compiled together. But for a lot of these organizations, for tiny municipalities, we got one response.
in the large ones, do you know whether they coordinated on their responses about each other?
I don't know.
Yeah.
They range to similar, we took generally the more optimistic response. At least for the relationship ties for the consumption one might have taken a mean.
Mhm.
I don't know if they work together. No one ever asked that question.
And did you ask them anything about what they meant by effectiveness or effectiveness relative to what?
What we asked was not all that specific. It was how effective do you think you and your nearest collaborators are at doing flood planning?
At doing flood
Yeah.
planning,
Yeah, doing flood planning.
with a hint toward referring that to the entire spatial scale of the whole watershed, or do you assume that there's a sort of professional norm, a shared understanding that anybody working on flood planning in this place is going to have sort of the same goal?
What do you mean? So, we were thinking about like their own actions, so not necessarily for the whole watershed, because, I mean, if you're a provincial government, theoretically, you should be concerned with the whole watershed. So, but.
Yeah, you should, but well, you should if the scope of your responsibilities is coincident with the scale of the whole watershed. But if you're a municipal authority in an upriver town, then you may well have a different conception of your goal than if you're a provincial or a trans-jurisdictional organization, or for that matter, if you're a municipal official down in St. John at the mouth. And in fact, the very fact of these spillovers and linkages, it's like what she does upstream affects what happens to you downstream. It translates to objectives, right? Because the upstream person might have a set of objectives that are relative to upstream interests. And if they're an aggregate government body, those interests might be comprehensive. It might be everything about what life is like in Edmonton, or right? And so, I mean, I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with this, but it might be different. It might be different than what the objectives of somebody in St. John is, or somebody at the province of Brunswick, or God forbid, if there's some interjurisdictional watershed planning authority, like that they would have. So.
No, we might have different objectives. We were sort of asking, because we had previously, before getting to that sort of summary question, asked them about the different tasks.
Yes.
And for each task, their effectiveness. So the intention was to be like, okay, so this is what you're doing, how overall, it was an overall indication of how you think it's going, like for you and your nearest collaborators.
Oh, wait, actually, a moment ago, it sounded like you actually asked them more. You asked them a more differentiated question. How do you perceive your effectiveness? What are your tasks? And then how do you perceive your effectiveness relative to this one, this one, this one?
For each, yeah, so
For
we
each
have
task.
it at each task level, and then we ask the overall as well. So the overall, when I modeled node level, I used that overall measure just because it had to be binary. So
yeah,
it's,
but that might open up some interesting possibilities. Obviously, you'd have to apply retrospective judgment, but it's like if there's significant difference in perceived effectiveness across tasks and significant correlations spatially among different organizations. Oh, this task, it looks like perceived effectiveness is strongly correlated, and this one, it looks like these ones that look really highly effective, and these other ones look really. So maybe there's more in mind.
yeah. So for the task analysis, for instance, like the one for my PhD, you have the modeling to like task effectiveness. We have a control variable that is like a dummy task. So that was the most effective task. We kind of controlled for it there. So we didn't control for it. Like I didn't look specifically, with organizations in different spaces. But I have
And corresponding tasks, and if there was a relationship.
Yeah, everyone.
Thanks. Very interesting. Yeah.
That was really interesting. I'm wondering if you can apply what you were saying about POLIS to your work. So you recognize that output doesn't impact change perhaps, but that like translating that output to impact, how would you, as an individual, as maybe the Oliver of this river on the East Coast, like how would you action that? Learning from what you know from this work.
All of us keeping.
But we really well with that.
Yeah, so we have tried, so given we're not there. We live in Ontario, we're not in Australia, so that's huge limitation there, but given we're not there, we had tried to do was do some webinars and present at the river summit. So WWF had previously had a role, skating role now. Had a yearly summit, so we've been engaging in sort of those data pieces. If I was all over there, what I would want to do is one scheme with all the municipalities. Because they do a lot of the same tasks, and they do a lot of the same things, but we really see that there's not a lot of relationships among municipalities. And that might be a need to just, I see that they're all really small, but there could also be benefits and even sharing of sort of like something to work on some of these sort of like climate adaptation pieces. And one might think that the provincial government could have a role in that. We did not see that role in sort of the qualitative research that we did. So I think there could be an opportunity for someone, it can't really be me, I'm not there to, you know, go and actually meet with people. But say, okay, well, you guys are both doing adaptation plans. We want to have a meeting about how you're doing your adaptation plans and then we share about how those things are going, what challenges you have. Like I think just like this being a little network nymph and going, you two are doing the same thing. It's sort of a meeting. I talk about, you know, the things you're working on. No, wow, you're doing the same thing.
So what about this idea that collaboration is that in and of itself lead to effectiveness? So you're gonna be the nymph that allows people to collaborate. How do you ensure that that collaboration increases that effectiveness, reflection or perception?
I think this idea that it needs to be more flexible. And when we write about it, it's like, oh, we need to work together. We say, okay, what? So
The intentionality.
well, it's the intentionality. And some, you know, we're gonna spur something and it might just fall apart based on personality. Some things will get in control. But I think if you were trying to be sort of like a pushing factor and trying to sort of impose that intentionality, then you know what a problem people are having. Oh, it's, you know, let's discuss a very specific thing. It's like, yeah, you know, what's going on with water? Like, try to keep conversations in focus and also just create spaces for people to like each other.
Okay, and one last question, this is, we're interviewing people around the province for this project on climate displacement and health. And one of the things that often comes up is the onus on individuals around relationships, having relationships across organizations. But then if somebody is burnt out and leaves an organization, then all of that effort that was put into that tie or that relationship is all of a sudden gone. So how do you bake that redundancy or that the spirit behind what Oliver does can continue if Oliver's not there, right? And so the way in which we can incorporate these kinds of ties into our governance systems without being dependent on the champions or the advocates that put in all the work to do that, or is that possible?
I think that comes down to like a little bit of organization structure in terms of not just having one person who's only the touch, like maybe that's a team of 2 or 3 who like show up to meetings and like actively engage, or having, yeah, I think it's that. Because if you have if you have a key organization who really has a role that their role is mandated and you have to be following through on, I don't think if that's a critical role, that should be one person. Like so much of our resilience literature is unique redundancy. And even in the networking plateau, in the first round of it, there is this one organization in New Brunswick that indicated they had ties with all of the different organizations in Maine. And went through one. Like that's a chunk of the watershed that apparently only talks and like I don't think that's our diagrams aren't reflective of every organization, because not everyone responded. They're like, this is a big weakness, like maybe others see also just like it's great.
Before I hand it over to Beate, just a quick follow-up question. Are academics and scholarly research on that part of your network analysis? Do you include them? Because if you think about collaboration and impact, they could become part of this very network that you're
Yeah, we
studying.
had some academics at one of the universities who are doing, there's one group that's doing flooding research, and we also had their sustainability department who's doing some more like practical work.
Beate and Oliver? I'm not sure about that.
Actually, it's very close to your question, because I was kind of stunned to hear that outputs are not counted as much as we think they should, right? On the other hand, you have those champions, let's say, that can move and collaborate or bring collaborations together and make impact happening. So I'm wondering, in terms of future career, wouldn't we all want to find the people that actually connect outputs to the people and to the networks? Like, I think we have to very much care and focus on making the outputs kind of usable and readable and understandable. And so, we have a lot of champions that don't understand at all the topics. Not that I'm thinking about you at all, but it's a danger to give a lot of credibility and a lot of power to, humans receiving their whatever skill sets they have that are so amazingly successful, but not coming back to the content and of people that have studied it or put together the data or surround.
So I think it has to, I think the outputs are useful because they're obviously a means to immediately communicate with all your other experts. And we obviously have them, they serve their own purpose or they can keep them in a world. That can be neutral. I mean, you can make a value judgment, good or bad, but that can also just be neutral. But then I guess it's the idea of like, how does the expert then engage with the people who can use it? Because they're not going to want to read the output.
I understand that completely. I am doing this since 20 years, and that's exactly the problem, that we have outputs and people that are actually not interested to make it policy savvy because the energy goes towards students, towards research, towards everything else. But this link to another client or group like policymakers is extremely difficult and not in their realms at all. So the thing is that I see is there's a missing link between this, let's say, policy driven and the scholars that create their information. They should not be the ones to actually deliver it. That's just what I try to make interesting to your future career.
I think in some ways Oliver is like a little bit that way because talking to people who are not in academia, they think
Keep not the power.
It's really fun. I'm like, So I just think there's like a place, and maybe these individuals already exist, and it's kind of behind that curtain kind of thing. We don't interact with them, or maybe they don't exist, and we need more of them. The people who are trained as experts, even if it's not quite to the same degree or specificity, but who can fully understand the outputs and who can engage with the outputs, engage with the researchers at that technical level, but then who can also translate it. I think that there's been an increased emphasis to do that in sort of the science communication world, where it's like, here's a paper, and now here are outputs for the general public. That's good. That's needed. It also seems like in terms of things that are less just quantitative sciencey, like in sort of maybe the social science governance realm, what is that equivalent actor? Maybe we need more of those actors. Where we face them, I don't know. But that seems like that'd be a very useful role to play in terms of getting ideas into application.
Funding agencies and institutions like the university, and they become more proactive, say, you need to somehow make sure there's impact, measure it, but they're rather naive about how your output is related to a real impact. This last step is very hard to measure, and the incentive for an aspiring young academic, it's so concrete, right? Is your next scholarly article will give you a form of credibility in the community, then your policy outreach and your networking building and so forth. Right? That's where we are. But sorry, was your next.
Well, yeah, I think it's to pick up on a couple of threads. I have a real question here too, but I can selfishly have you time to talk about that. But two things. I think that just on the point we're making about outputs, and I think it's important to say it's not outputs. You have to be credible. You have to be authentic. So it's probably necessary, might be too strong a word, but it's close to necessary, but it's sort of not sufficient. And I think the piece that I would pick off on it for how to have the impact from the university, the underutilized power the university has is the convening power. In this complex world we live in, it's increasingly hard to have a dialogue except by the echo chamber, by your own sort of sub niche. And universities are one of the few, I think, and we can argue, is it good, is it perfect? I don't know, but it's above average, it's above the most. And that's where the role of the outputs come. And in most cases, all we need to know is you produce some outputs. And then how willing are you? And this is to your point, who are these intermediaries? I actually do have some expertise, folks. It's some stuff that nobody else would be interested in either. Let's talk about administrative law, right? I can do that, right? But to be effective in a policy realm, you have to be a generalist. You have to engage people where they're at. You have to be able to connect. And you have to be able to talk, inch deep, mile wide on a bunch of stuff to start the conversation so you can get to the kind of goods. And I think that's a whole different skill set. So I think we could have a whole, this is great for the center to talk about this kind of stuff. But I do think the idea of that convening power, because you can bring people in, you can bring different voices, you can have, and I think when done well, and the center is a good example of it, is there's the place for the top expert in a given field to sit in the same room with the undergrad who's just starting on the journey. And if you can't do that, you're never going to be effective, because you have to be able to talk, all that stuff. And you can talk endlessly about the role of redundancy. Believe it or not, it's a purposeful model. The Rosie experiment is exactly that. Like, what if I got hit by a bus? 15 years ago, we would have been in trouble. Now we wouldn't be, right? So that you can do that. And the question of who funds and how do you fund it? I'll just point to the guy in the top left corner.
Actually, has a question.
Yeah, you both have a question, you have a statement, but it'll be exactly that nuance of how to invest in those kinds of people who want to move across the realms. But now I'm going to ask my real question. Just so you know, I've asked you a question. You don't have expertise. Anybody knows some stuff, but I'm really interested because I do think it's a powerful conclusion. It certainly matches with my own lived experience, and I certainly haven't studied it, but there is too much collaboration and too much line is sometimes there's these organizations in my field, I won't name names, but we always talk about they can never land the plane. They don't land the plane. They're just in the talk shop mode, and they're connecting, but to no end. And in fact, people at the right time, right? So this idea of optimized collaboration and cooperation is powerful. I think it's worth thinking about. But I want to not challenge, but I want to see the tension, because in a resilience framework, where we're talking about uncertainty and when we're talking about nonlinear processes, you probably don't want to optimize, do you? You want to build redundancy. So how do you resolve or reconcile these two very important concepts in the kind of work you're doing or going to do, so that you can say, okay, yes, we could be more efficient. The resilience framework, when we're talking about the kind of resilience issues, so we might water.
I think what's interesting when we use the multi-level approach, like model it, or to think about it quantitatively, is that we want to see some of those being able to land a plane might be two organizations working on the same task. Like that was organizations felt more effective, like we had that sort of like not at high level, but at the organization level. So having specific relationships, but that doesn't preclude that any, you know, social relationship in that network needs to be aligned with a specific task. With a specific task or a different policy area. Like, it doesn't need to be a perfect little only triangles network. But you know, that sort of like entangled square, it doesn't just need to be all entangled. There's still space for things that might not be optimal based on today's definition. Like, oh, we're working on different things, but we work, you know, there's still a relationship there, and maybe the task will change. Maybe you can bring a different partner, or maybe there's a new task, and then, oh wait, now suddenly our mandates have changed. We both need to do this thing, and we already kind of coordinate a little bit. There's new opportunity. So it's like it doesn't have to be perfectly optimized, like you might think of it in terms of like something in engineering, that you think of multi-level structure and you know what they'll create. It can be kind of chaotic, but we still want to see, you know, flow trends in it that could be associated with something effective. You still have some of that, you know, space to.
So it's a judgment of feel, more art than science.
Oh yeah, it's all, well, modeling networks is art. I think
Just to follow up on this, are you saying, when you were saying that if you have several organizations in the same location, they're not effective, I mean, that was kind of what I took from it, but are you saying that they become less effective than they could be, but they're still effective? You know, I mean, so you talk about, you know, education, environmental education, but we got all kinds of groups, right? There's this umbrella thing in Victoria that, forget the name, they list all these, and then they sometimes so do they, you know, is there a point at which, or is it kind of a moment or a kind of a situation in which organizations block each other, or is it simply that they do the same thing, or they don't do it as fast as they could be if they were more tightly linked, a small group were tightly linked? I mean, what exactly was the effectiveness point that you were making?
So what we like found in this context,
Yeah.
Organizations tended to be more effective if they worked together on a task.
If they work together on a
Yeah,
task,
together
yeah.
on a task that was associated with more
Yeah.
effectiveness. What we didn't see in that same configuration, it didn't matter if they were both was thinking, sorry. So that was at the organization level. So me, my organization, I feel better about my work when I'm working with someone else. It's a good thing.
Yeah.
I feel better about adaptation planning with a manager. What we didn't see was I don't know quality in my or how I feel as a profession about the adaptation planning if I'm working with someone in the same space. So the interaction should be at that task level, because that's how we define it. Like, I feel better about adaptation planning when I work with someone in the same space. It might just be like, maybe that helps the whole organization, maybe that helps
So
the basin. It's just like, where is there, we didn't see a benefit at this specific.
because everyone might say, yeah, I mean, they're all doing stuff that's really supportive of the ultimate goal that we as outsiders might perceive as protecting from flooding and so on, right?
It as a system, you're gonna see things that are like different, we call them levels, or maybe at the community, or maybe it's, you know, in 5 years with certain benefits of it. But where we were measuring it, you know.
Ivan, you're next, and then sorry, Ivan, would you mind sharing me your text, or you are right? You've been basically, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, no problem, and thanks a great presentation. Great to see you again. Yeah, in my mangled questionnaire, which was, just trying to just complicate things really. But there is this, because I agree, of course, with your premise that the, outputs in themselves don't need to change. Then we have create these effective networks, but there is still ultimately, the missing piece. Like, where is the strategic leadership that actually gets us from those outputs to the actual change? Now, and victory has 1,000 parents, as we know, but we usually tell a whole lot of stories in retrospect. But in my experience, at least, there's often a small group of folks that are actually leading to this sort of effective, coordinated, collaborative impact. In my experience as a funder, over the at fairly large scale, at times we found ourselves actually taking strategic leadership because of the power of the allocation of resources. We're making decisions as to who in that network actually gets powered up with the resources to pay more attention to the other parts of it, and so on, has that resource. So so by de facto we end up in a strategic leadership position, in some position, and in fact that's been quite criticized. If you look at the criticisms of, say, Bill Gates, the Gates Foundation in Africa, and so on, it's the power of this kind of de facto. So anyway, I don't really have the answer to this. I'm not expecting necessarily, but it's an important, I think, consideration is, where does strategic leadership lie? Does the power, just to put a exclamation point on it, does whoever actually buys TikTok next get control of the biggest network in the planet and the influence over it? Is that who gets to do it? Is it going to be Microsoft? Like, who is it? Or is it staying with where, that's a real issue today. We've created these virtual networks that are incredibly powerful and influential, which we're now, anyway. So I just raise that question. Where does legitimate strategic leadership around these networks lie? And I guess in behind that is the question, what safeguards do we need to create to make sure that in a legitimate and just place?
Thank you very much.
How about for a wicked question?
Yeah, that's good. So what we saw, or at least like in the case study, was interesting. There's a lot of very active environmental NGOs in the area, and they're funding and people. So that was interesting to see. There's also a couple a little bit risky to put that in the hands of a panda bear kind of organization. In terms of like long-term, there's a lot of power to be in environmental NGOs who don't have consistent funding whatsoever. So you're like, as a collective, sort of take your head, you're like, no, this doesn't feel good. So it really does seem wherever there's money, there's obviously money's power. What we see in sort of, I'll say, the broad literature is that bottom up is great, things that are rooted in place can be very effective, but there tends to be a limitation, like they aren't able to necessarily surmount what we want unless there is some top-down accompanying support. So things that emerge, if there isn't that top-down support, they seem to hit a ceiling and aren't able to continue. So you kind of need it for both. So if you are imposing money into a system, like spurring the bottom up, that's going to get you somewhere. You might be able to get further if there's a top-down component that's in agreement with that. I guess that's, I don't know, maybe that was helpful.
I just want to pick up on a theme though, just a practical part, in the sense that it, you know, I think again of an asset that the university brings. Universities are a little bit insulated from the whimsical philanthropy, sort of it's the mal philanthropy. Because, you know, people have jobs, they can feed and eat, and they're insulated from whether they get the grant or not, so there's that component. But the other part is they can bring resources, especially so communities, which is where the majority of our work is, right? So we sort of, you know, we focus really tactically at the top, but we sort of operate generally at the bottom and raise. And so little things like linking an intern, 10 hours of research a week to a small organization is huge. It builds their legitimacy, their impact, the ability to link to a grant, be objective to advise a grant provider that you should have done in this group because it's a good example. That kind of role again is, I don't know many places, but a university brings that advantage. So again, an advantage over the paper or the course being taught is actually some of these components which are consistent with some of the network analysis. I mean, we're just talking informally here, but I think it's an important recognition that again, the freedom though, to be in an institution so that you can operate a little bit in that space is hard.
I mean, personally, I think that's correct, and I mean, if you look at the environmental studies, they do plenty of that, right?
Yeah.
And the impacts are significant, I think, you know, and even political science, they have people in parliament and like that makes it's an influence on them, but they're being observed, right, by students. You don't want to be observed and act really stupid, right?
Yeah.
I don't know.
So my question was very much related to that. I was wondering if you analyzed, and of course, I guess you did, the funding, the resources available, how do they finance their activities, these NGOs that you analyzed, and whether this has, have you seen if there is an impact of this funding on their self-proclaimed efficiency, and also if they're looking always for projects to finance their activities, how sustainable can these outputs can be, because they're always going to be shifting. So considering the temporality dimension that you also mentioned, how this limited funding related to a project maybe relates to the temporality of temporality dimension of the system that you have explained. Like,
That all makes sense. And so when I'm thinking to sort of the conclusion that I had from my master's work, the question we asked was really like, what barriers are you facing sort of in collaboration and in flood planning? And a lot of the responses I had was, we don't have money. Or, you know, I've spent half my time putting grants, or I'm putting a grant for an 18-month federal project based on, you know, the focus of feds at the time. So I have to, you know, and I'll say some people are probably better at, you know, doing the thing where you say we're gonna do something and then you do something else and you do what you want with it. Some people might be, you know, more stuck in a box based on what it is. And so a lot of feedback was, you know, we don't really have enough money. It's hard to necessarily maintain relationships if we don't know if we're going to get the next project. Then we can do the planning phase, you know, with money per year, but we can't necessarily do another application. So that was a lot of the responses that we got back, and that they were competing with each other, even though they wanted to work together because they're small, and then also that they weren't feeling supported by the provincial government. That was usually said a lot of words and stuff. And but so yeah, so that's how we interpret it. And because one of the analysis, there's been some theory that when you end up with, like, if you have 3 organizations working together, it can be an indication of that there's more risk in the network. Maybe because you need to monitor people. That's like one explanation. I don't think that necessarily applies in this context. They're generally very, you know, they want to be in these relationships. They don't have to work together, but you see kind of like that a bit of a higher risk scenario. And so we interpreted it as they don't have a ton of organizations that it's harder to commit to a project or to these relationships when you're relying on your funding cycles. You know, like good stability. And it came up I was able to attend Globe. With Oliver, and so there was a capital, it was like a whole little workshop on how to better finance conservation initiatives. And the people at the table were around me, were like, yeah, well, it's really helpful if we have baseline funding. So we can just like plan projects and then do projects and then, you know, have some class and get bigger chunks of money, but just so we can, you know, exist. And not having to worry about not existing is really helpful. And so, you know, in reflecting like that idea had definitely come through in sort of the responses I was getting.
Getting close to the end, we'll allow, you know, a general question, maybe a final reflection. What is a surprising, maybe counterintuitive finding of your network analysis? You know, so is there something that really stood out for you to say, look, you know, that's what I wouldn't have, you know, expected to come out of this?
I was kind of shocked that there wasn't any significant findings in that same location network. I was a little disappointed at the time. And I presented it at an Australian network conference, like, just finished the analysis of the slides, and I was like, what does it mean? Like, there's no result. It is a result, but wasn't what I was anticipating. And so I think it's an interesting thing. It's like, okay, maybe there is an outcome, but it's just at a different level. And think of like how benefits may emerge in the system, it might just be something that we're not measuring. It's hard to measure something. Yeah, that was what was really surprising.
Bridget, it's been such a pleasure having you, you know, realizing that you're leaving very, very soon indeed, right? And so I'd love to see you back, and you can tell, you know, this resonates strongly with us. You know, I think there's lots of interest in the room and on the screen to think about creatively, you know, what do we do with scholarly knowledge, right? And how can we have an impact, and what are the proper mechanisms? So best of luck with finalizing your work, and hope to see you back here. I'm sure that Rod would have loved this discussion today, so that would be great. But yeah, it's thank you for doing this so shortly before your leaving, and welcome back anytime.